After finishing up work, our protagonist announces that he's heading home. A coworker then asks if he's finished everything, but he just ignores her and says he's out of there. But before he can leave, someone stops him in the hallway. With a hand on his shoulder, the man reminds him about the company dinner. Suddenly, the bald guy grabs him and asks if he really thought he could just skip out. Meanwhile, other employees are gossiping about how the assistant manager is bailing on the dinner tonight. Our protagonist is getting annoyed. They're always working overtime, and today was the first time he was actually leaving on schedule. Someone touches his shoulder and says they understand. Turning his head, our guy sees it's his colleague, Legion. She then says she knows how tough it's been, since they've been working themselves to death. With tears welling up in his eyes, the guy gets emotional, thinking that finally someone understands him. However, the woman suddenly perks up and shouts that this just means they're going to drink until they drop tonight. Seo Ji-hun is in shock, realizing she's on the exact same wavelength as everyone else. He wonders how he ended up in a place where everyone is a workaholic and acts like a total maniac. Completely drained, he decides to just ignore it all and leave. However, he comes face to face with a mysterious man at the door. Our protagonist then realizes this guy was someone who had shown up at the office earlier. Seeing that the man seemed unstable, Ji-hun decides to get him out of there as quickly as possible. Turns out, earlier that day, his colleagues had said they couldn't help the man because they were following orders from their superiors. The young man tries to calm the situation down, asking the man to go home since it's already late. But the guy accuses him of being ignored, though the employee tries to explain it was just procedure. Just then, his colleague approaches and says that business hours are over and he should come back tomorrow. Suddenly, the young woman looks terrified and covers her face with her hands. The man had landed a solid punch right on Ji-hun while yelling about being ignored. The sudden attack sends the entire office into a panic. The assailant then pulls out a knife and lunges at him, screaming that it was all their fault. Lying on the ground, injured, the young man doesn't understand a word the man is saying and starts to wonder what he really wanted. His only wish was to live a quiet life, working and relaxing in moderation without any stress. But suddenly, the scene changes, and now he's in some ancient place, getting thrown violently to the ground. After the fall, he puts a hand on his stomach, wondering if he's okay. Completely panicked, he can't understand what's happening. He figures he was attacked and is now in this new body, which is named Ilmak. Someone then orders him to fetch water, and he responds by calling the person uncle. In fact, it's been a year since he was attacked by that guy and reborn. The young man realized he'd been given a second chance to live a different kind of life. Now he was in a world of martial arts, where he had been transmigrated into a new body. Fortunately, thanks to the original owner's memories, he didn't have much trouble adapting. On top of that, his new job was just doing a few chores and running errands for a local inn. So his old motto of working and relaxing in moderation fit this new life perfectly. He thought he could just kick back and relax for the rest of his life, but that thought didn't last long. One day while working, he saw a huge explosion. Rushing to the scene, he found an old white-haired man standing in front of a building. The old man turns around with a serious look on his face. Meanwhile, our guy was panting, completely out of breath. He had no idea what he was supposed to do. In desperation, he wonders why of all places their inn had to be the one to catch fire, but he decides to act, pouring water over his head and thinking that his first priority is getting people out of there. So he shouts for his uncle, saying he's coming to rescue him, but the old man just stares back in silence. Suddenly, the old man draws his sword and points it at our protagonist. Completely terrified, Ilmak has no clue what's going on and can only think about saving the people inside. In that moment, he realizes the terrible truth. It was that old man who attacked the inn. The white-haired man then reveals the bizarre reason for his attack, saying the noodles were awful. Our protagonist is in disbelief, wondering how someone could do something like this for such a trivial reason. However, the old man insists it wasn't trivial. The food was bad, and that's why he burned the place down. The old man then says the boy is a waste of talent, and so he's going to give him a chance. With a serious gaze, the man invites him to become his disciple. But right after, he threatens him, saying that if he refuses, he'll finish him right then and there. The young man then remembers his death in his past life and thinks about the irony of his current situation. With the sword still at his neck, he stares at the old man who's waiting for an answer. Filled with rage, our protagonist finally explodes, screaming that he can't take this crap anymore. Indignant, the young man yells that just because he has a weapon doesn't mean he can do whatever he wants. The man with the eye patch wonders if the protagonist is some kind of lunatic. Furious, he yells at the old man to shut up and give him back his long-awaited peaceful life. Just then, the man with the eye patch strikes him in the neck, knocking him out instantly. Lying on the ground, our protagonist is now at the mercy of the man with the eye patch. Even while unconscious, he thinks that unlike his past life, at least this time he said what he truly felt. While the protagonist is on the ground, the man with the eye patch asks the old man what they should do with him. After a moment of silence, the old master finally makes a decision and tells them to take him. Some time later, we see a carriage traveling along a road near a cliff. Suddenly, the protagonist wakes up to a shout from inside the carriage. As he opens his eyes, he sees the old man sitting in front of him, who simply says, "You're awake." The protagonist is surprised to still be alive. He thought the old man would have eliminated him after that outburst. However, the old man starts to speak, saying he first needs to apologize for a lie he told. He then reveals that he wasn't the one responsible for the attack on the inn, leaving the protagonist completely confused. With a serious look, the master reveals that the true culprits behind everything are the Martial Alliance. The old man explains that the Martial Alliance framed him to rally their forces, but the protagonist just thinks he's going senile. but then he reflects that the martial artists he's met were basically thugs, so the story does make some sense. He then asks why he lied, and the master replies that he wanted to see his true nature. With a confused look, the protagonist doesn't understand what the old man means by that. The old man says he was impressed because he chose to die rather than become the disciple of his supposed enemy. Smiling proudly, the old man praises his perception, but Ilmak thinks he's genuinely senile. The protagonist then reflects that, in reality, he didn't have any other choice in that situation. After all, no one would believe an errand boy, and they'd surely blame him for the whole crime. The master then says he only has two options. One is to become his disciple and follow him. The other option is to be eliminated by the hands of the powerful and feared martial alliance. After hearing all this, the protagonist starts to adjust his position on the seat. He sits up straighter and composes his posture. He lets out a long sigh. He then asks for the old man's name, who notices the change in his tone of voice, which seems to please him. The old man finally reveals his identity, saying his name is Hyokrion Ilwi. The protagonist comments that the name Hyokrion doesn't sound familiar, but the master says his title is more well known. With a breathtaking view in the background, the old man reveals that in the Central Plains, he is known as the Heavenly Demon. The Heavenly Demon is a symbol of overwhelming martial power and rules over the dreaded demonic cult. This sect is also known by other names depending on the era, like the Sun Moon sect or the Ming cult. Basically, this means he's the leader of a very powerful and influential cult in this world. The one major difference is that the power of a leader like this is always absurdly strong and unmatched. The protagonist thinks he'd refuse if it were a modern-day cult, but since it's not a criminal group, maybe it's not so bad. Finally, the carriage stops, and they're informed that they've reached their destination. Hyokrion then asks for the boy's name, and he replies that he has no surname, he's just Ilmak. The old master smiles and repeats the protagonist's name as he steps out of the carriage. After also getting out of the carriage, the protagonist looks shocked. Outside, we see why he's so stunned. There are hundreds of people kneeling and greeting the cult master. They all shout in unison, hailing the master as the Lord of 10,000 demons. Ilmak is blown away by the scene and thinks it's a bit much to be the leader of such a massive cult. Looking at the old man, he thinks about the title Heavenly Demon. He thinks to himself that this man doesn't really look like someone with such a grand title. He then introduces the place to his new disciple, telling him that this is Pongyam Hall. The master then gestures to the enormous property and says that this will be his home if he agrees to be his disciple. The old man promises to personally investigate who sent the assassins to the old inn. The old man understands the protagonist's pain, as a man who was like a father to him was lost in the attack. He vows to help him in the name of the Heavenly Demon, regardless of his final decision. Without a second thought, the protagonist bows in a gesture of gratitude and calls him master. Seeing the young man's attitude, the Heavenly Demon asks if he has made his final decision. Ilmak confirms that he's made up his mind, and since his body has no other choice, he'll give it his all. Hyokrion is pleased with the answer and says the boy has thought his decision through well. However, he explains that as the leader, he must care for all beings in the divine cult. Therefore, he will assign an attendant who will serve as a guard and help the protagonist learn about the cult. Happy with the opportunity, the protagonist thanks the master with a smile on his face. He then turns and looks out at the courtyard, curious about who his new assistant will be. He then sees his master approaching a woman and figures that must be his new attendant. He's shocked by the woman's beauty, thinking she looks like a celebrity, but he quickly scolds himself, remembering that mentally, he's over 30 and feels embarrassed. Just then, the girl approaches and formally introduces herself as young master Ilmak's attendant. She then reveals that her name is Jin Hyon, and the protagonist wonders if he should reconsider everything. With a goofy grin, he remembers that his current body is 15, so there isn't that much of an age gap. However, the woman interrupts him and says he needs to prepare for admission into the demonic hall. The protagonist is confused by the sudden information and wonders what this place is. She explains that it's the largest educational institution where members age 16 are admitted, and since he's the master's disciple, he's expected to be the top student, which doesn't sound like an easy task. The attendant then states that time is short and begins to tie her hair with a ribbon. But suddenly, a strong gust of wind blows in her direction. All at once, the atmosphere around them changes completely, becoming much more intense and cold. With a serious look, the girl vows that she will make him the strongest of all. The training begins with her making him repeat phrases like Advent of the Heavenly Demon. But his voice is weak as he repeats the words while doing exercises with a rock on his back. With his hands trembling on the ground, he can barely repeat the phrase the woman ordered him to. His attendant watches him with a serious and piercing gaze, showing no mercy. The girl then yells at him to straighten his arms, but the protagonist groans in pain from the effort. With his body at its limit, he can't take it anymore and collapses completely onto the courtyard floor. Annoyed, the woman shouts at him, ordering him to get up immediately. But the protagonist says he can't go on, and that he absolutely cannot continue. She reminds him that he was threatened and chose the cult, but he denies it in his thoughts. Grabbing him by the shoulders, the instructor yells that now he's going to endure it all, whether he likes it or not. The protagonist just stares back at her with an expression of pure exhaustion and disbelief. With an exhausted sigh, his face goes a bit limp, and he looks like he's about to pass out again. He then collapses onto her shoulder, thinking that these cult bastards are ruthless. As she holds him, the woman gives a slight, satisfied smile at the results of the training. In reality, the protagonist's training far exceeded the limits of a normal person. The fact that he endured so much without any prior training proves his body is special, a divine gift. The attendant wonders who he is for the Heavenly Demon to have recognized such talent in him. Impressed, she carries him, thinking about how she couldn't help but revere her master, and shouts the cult's motto. Later that night, the full moon illuminates the room where our protagonist is resting. He then wakes up sweating and wonders where he is. as he remembers training with Hayeon. Looking down, he sees her massaging his back with a blue energy and is completely shocked. Suddenly, a strong wave of energy surges through his body and the protagonist shouts at the strange sensation. He leaps to his feet and notices his body feels reinvigorated, while the woman watches him calmly. She then explains that while he was resting, she was using a technique to restore his energy. The instructor says she's not finished and tells him to lie down, but she calls him Demon Sergeant. This triggers terrible memories of his time in the army in his past life, and he starts to panic. Furious, the protagonist points at his attendant and says he can't live like this anymore. He then demands at least one rest period per hour to maintain his work-life balance. However, his instructor simply denies the request. The woman explains that he's 15 and has only 1 year left until admission, so there's no time. Desperate, the protagonist asks what she'll do if he dies from overwork first, but she coldly replies that he isn't weak enough to collapse from that training. She then says that if that happens, she will gladly follow him to the other side without hesitation. The protagonist gets angry and calls her a fanatic, telling her to stop with the fake loyalty. But thanks to this, a risky yet surefire solution pops into his mind to solve the problem. The attendant realizes that arguing with words is pointless and just stares at him. He then turns his back and says he'd rather give up on everything than live like this. Not understanding, the woman asks what he means by that as she watches him act strangely. The protagonist shouts that he's going to embarrass his master so he'll get kicked out. With his hands on his hips, he stands there, waiting for the girl's reaction. Her face suddenly darkens, and she asks if he's not going to regret that statement. Despite the sweat trickling down his face, he confidently replies that of course he won't regret it. With her eyes glowing with anger, she says her master will have an incompetent disciple because of him. The instructor then asks if he really thinks she's just going to stand by and watch that happen. As he puts on a robe, the protagonist challenges her, asking what she plans to do. He barely finishes his sentence before she lunges at him, her eyes red with fury. The girl grabs the protagonist by the collar of his robe. Holding him by the collar, the woman says, "So be it," as a blue aura envelops her. With her hand on his neck, she declares that she will cut down any disgrace to her master without hesitation. With an insane look in her eyes, the instructor says she would gladly take her own life to protect her master. The protagonist then confronts her, saying she just gave him a reason to become a traitor to the cult. She shoves him back forcefully. The girl leaps backward, though she's still furious. Adjusting his robe, the young man thinks to himself that just as he imagined, his plan worked perfectly. The instructor recovers and glares at him, and he thinks that being bold was the right choice. With a crazed look, he provokes her, saying his only strength is being the heavenly demon's disciple. The woman thinks that it would be a stain on her master's name if he ran away, so she can't let him go. The protagonist reflects that to take advantage of the situation, he needed to create a dramatic atmosphere. Confused and worried, the attendant wonders what to do, and he thinks to himself that the fanatic took the bait. Pretending to cough, the protagonist continues his act to convince the girl of his sincerity. He then says it's not like he doesn't want to train, and she listens attentively. Holding up 2 fingers, the protagonist states that there are only 2 things he really wants. He reveals that the first condition is to rest every 2 hours of training, and the other is more sleep time. She then asks if that's all it will take, and the protagonist stammers that yes, it is. With that, he promises to train hard if she agrees, because he doesn't want to be a burden to her master. With an intimidating glare, the woman agrees and warns that she expects him to keep his promise to train hard. She then says she'll finish the treatment from before and asks him to lie down again. In that moment, the disciple wonders if he wasn't a bit too bold in making so many demands of the woman. The next day, it was time for special training with the powerful heavenly demon. Upon arriving at the location, the master lets out a little laugh, seeming to be in a very good mood that day. But he finds the protagonist and his instructor, with the protagonist lying unconscious. The instructor then says it's all thanks to the great concentration the protagonist possesses. Lying on the ground, he thinks it would be strange to remain weak after training so much. Even with the breaks, the training is still brutal, and he thinks he would have already died without his rest periods. The heavenly demon is satisfied with the result as the woman helps him walk. The master approaches and says that from this day forward, the young man will learn the demonic arts. Sweating nervously, the protagonist faces his master with a serious expression. However, the demonic arts in this cult aren't evil. They are a power used to protect the innocent. So the term demonic arts is just a general name for the martial arts of the heavenly demon cult. The protagonist thinks this is different from the evil arts of his past life, but he won't accept something he doesn't understand. Raising his hand, he asks the master if there are any disadvantages to learning these arts. The old man laughs and asks what disadvantage there could possibly be in the martial arts of his sacred cult. The protagonist thinks that there's no problem then, and his master says that in fact there are only advantages. However, the heavenly demon reveals that there might be some side effects. The old man mentions the risk of chi deviation, and in his head the protagonist curses him for not warning him sooner. Still, he asks if he can know beforehand the types of arts and their side effects. The master agrees, saying that he intended to explain this to his disciple one day anyway. With that, he tells the protagonist to listen carefully and think hard about which path he will follow. The first technique is the explosive power sword, which can destroy even mountain peaks, but its side effect is an anger management disorder that would drive the user insane. The second is the bare-handed demonic arts, an ice technique that freezes an entire area. The problem is that its side effect is an uncontrollable desire that makes one act strangely. The third option is the frenzied soul sword style, with movements that are very difficult to predict. However, its side effect is suffering from auditory and visual hallucinations all the time. Besides these, the master reveals that there are many other techniques with equally terrible side effects. At this, the protagonist despairs, wondering if he's supposed to choose a martial art or a mental illness. He is completely shocked and terrified by the terrible choice he has to make. He then asks the master if he has mastered all of these arts, and the old man calmly confirms it. In his mind, he says the old man isn't a heavenly demon but a walking asylum. The protagonist calms down and realizes that maybe he doesn't need to worry so much about it for now. His master then reassures him, saying there's nothing to fear, as the effects can be overcome. The old man explains that the first stage is when one begins to learn the demonic arts. The second stage is when the side effects of the arts reach their most dangerous peak. Finally, the practitioner manages to meditate and find their inner balance to advance. At that moment, they are freed from the demonic power and its side effects forever. This final stage is called transcendence and is the ultimate goal of all practitioners. With his hand raised, the protagonist asks what happens if someone never reaches that level. Placing a hand on his shoulder, the old man says he doesn't need to worry about that right now. The heavenly demon then reveals that this was the very reason he chose him as a disciple. He then asks if the protagonist remembers when he tested him on the day the ink caught fire. The master asserts that with a pure heart he can achieve transcendence, but he fears he might not succeed. Ignoring the doubt, the old man says that now it's time for him to make his decision and choose an art. The protagonist is surprised by the rush and thinks that in that case he already knows what he's going to do. With a determined look, he announces that he wishes to learn the soul-stealing sword art. This technique is characterized by continuous and fluid movements that steal the opponent's soul. However, the side effect of this art is obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. He thinks he can handle a moderate obsession, and that striving for perfection will increase his chances. The master agrees and says they will start with some basic stances. Excited, the protagonist nods in agreement. The old man explains that the first technique is the sword draw, which involves drawing and blocking at the same time. First, he demonstrates that the movement begins by taking a step back with the right foot, and at the same time, the practitioner must draw the sword in line with the opponent's attack. Finally, the practitioner must block the opponent's attack and prepare for the next strike. The heavenly demon then asks if he can keep up, and the protagonist confidently confirms. In his mind, he finds the explanation elaborate but believes it's just a matter of drawing the sword. With that, he wonders if it's really that difficult and tries to replicate the movement himself. However, when he tries, he fumbles and gets confused, not understanding what went wrong. The master then corrects him, saying it's not just about holding the sword tightly. He explains that he needs to pay attention to the angles of the sword and the scabbard in his hand. With the old man's help, he finally manages to draw the sword correctly. The old man praises him, saying he's doing well, and the protagonist thanks him, a bit embarrassed by the compliment. The master then warns that he will add some variations and asks him to continue following along. The two begin to train together, performing the movements side by side with intense concentration. We see the training intensify, and now they are practicing more direct combat. Our young man tries his best to keep up with the master's movements and learn the technique. He's surprised by his learning speed and wonders if it's because of his young body. The heavenly demon then says that he will now slowly demonstrate how to truly handle the sword. With his sword raised, the master orders his disciple to use the sword draw to block his attack. The protagonist tenses up at the sudden command, but the old man stares at him with a serious, challenging look. Despite the pressure, our hero manages to block the blow successfully. Pleased with the result, the old man praises him and tells him to continue training without hesitation. The combat continues, and the disciple keeps blocking all of the master's attacks perfectly. He's shocked to realize that he's blocking everything naturally, even without ever having practiced before. With another perfect block, the protagonist begins to wonder if he might be a martial arts genius. The heavenly demon then says that it seems he has already grasped the fundamentals of the technique. Panting and exhausted, our young man can barely breathe, but his master congratulates him on a job well done. With his body sweaty and tired, he thanks the old man for the lesson. He then looks at his trembling hands and wonders if this body really belongs to him. The master's last attack was so fast he barely followed it, but he managed to block without hesitation. The old man then says that in the remaining time he will teach the powerful internal energy method. With that, the two sit on the ground and the old man positions himself right behind him. The master then places his hands on the protagonist's back and says he will personally help him with his energy. The master explains that his internal energy will flow through the protagonist's acupoints. He then instructs him not to lose the rhythm and to follow the flow of energy coursing through his body. He feels a strange and unfamiliar sensation as the energy circulates within him. This is a feeling he has never experienced, and the master's power is gentle yet undeniable. Thanks to this noble teaching, he managed to memorize the flow of energy and the meridians. The blue energy continues to flow through his body as he focuses entirely on the training. With this, he manages to form an energy center, and the master congratulates him on starting his journey. The old man instructs him to strive for transcendence, and the protagonist confirms he got the message. Seeing his good progress, the old man invites him to have dinner with the other disciples that night. Our protagonist says he'll take a bath and then head to his master's quarters for dinner. With a satisfied smile, the heavenly demon agrees with the plan and says he'll be waiting. But the protagonist sighs, thinking he's about to have dinner with people who will be his rivals. The attendant says she will help him get ready. As they walk, he asks what art she learned, and the woman replies that it is the demonic art of frost. The protagonist then understands why frost forms around her, and the instructor simply confirms it. Surprised, the protagonist repeats the name of the minor frost art she uses. He then stares at her, breaking into a cold sweat while she remains standing seriously beside him. At that, he remembers the terrible side effect of that art, and the woman looks at him confused. Soon after, they arrive at a luxurious bathroom with a large green bathtub. While she helps him with his bath, he thinks he was getting used to this. But of all things, she had to learn the demonic art of frost. He thinks that if she gets consumed by its side effect, things could get complicated. With a mischievous smile, he gets a few ideas, but the woman quickly interrupts him. Suddenly, she dumps a bucket of cold water on his head. The attendant then reveals that the art's effect differs depending on gender. Surprised by this information, our protagonist asks what the effect is for women. She explains that for women, rationality increases and they think more coldly. He asks if there's anything else as he finds the effect too mild for a demonic art. With a serious look, the instructor pauses for a moment before continuing her explanation. She then reveals that empathy decreases, and he realizes they basically turn into psychopaths. The woman says the art punishes heretics and she doesn't see it as a side effect, but the protagonist just thinks she's a fanatic. He gets embarrassed and apologizes for the misunderstanding. With this frightening discovery, the protagonist decides he needs to start being much more careful from now on. Already dressed, he walks alongside his attendant. He thinks that what really matters, the real challenge, begins right now. According to what the instructor told him, he is the 8th disciple of the great and powerful heavenly demon. However, half of the disciples have already been lost in battle or to the side effects of the arts, leaving only 4. This means the survival rate is 50%, and he knows it won't be easy at all. But even with the imminent danger, he is fully determined to survive at any cost. Soon, he arrives before his master and introduces himself. As he greeted them, he declared in his mind that they wouldn't have an easy time with him. The master calls him closer and asks everyone to greet him properly and respectfully. The old man then introduces him as Ilmak, his youngest disciple, whom he took in during his old age. Suddenly, a loud laugh echoes through the room, startling the protagonist with the completely unexpected sound. A muscular man introduces himself as Wai Jinhyek, his eldest brother, and greets him with a smile. His sword art has the side effect of uncontrollable rage, a true fury disorder. Fortunately, he vented his fury on other martial artists and managed to escape the extreme state. However, the important thing is that he escaped the extreme state but did not achieve transcendence. This means he could explode at any moment, basically making him a walking time bomb. Even so, our protagonist greets him, but thinks to himself not to be fooled by the smile and to stay sharp. Despite the danger, the atmosphere doesn't seem too bad, and our protagonist feels a little relieved. He then thinks that the third brother should be easier to deal with since he's closer to his age. As he approaches to greet the third brother, he's attacked by something that zips past his neck. Completely confused, our protagonist looks at the chopsticks stuck in the wall. The brother then asks why he bowed to him twice, and our protagonist is shocked by the question. The man named So Wanpyeong asks if he's already treating him like a dead man, his gaze menacing. His art is a fast and silent sword technique specializing in assassinations, just as the name suggests. Its side effect is perceiving everything negatively, resulting in delusional paranoia. The problem is he has already mastered the extreme state, and our protagonist realizes he's totally screwed. Furious, the brother stands up and asks if he was praying for his funeral by bowing twice. The brother threatens him, saying he could have just bowed once, but our protagonist thinks it would have ended the same way. Desperate, our young man tries to think of an excuse, but he knows anything he says will be interpreted negatively. Just then, another man approaches and says the third brother is overreacting. He then says that hunger has made him sensitive and offers him a new pair of chopsticks to eat. The brother who defended the protagonist apologizes for his siblings. The man then touches our protagonist's shoulder to calm him down. The paranoid brother apologizes for his behavior, but the other man tells him not to worry. The protagonist is confused. He thought everyone here was a lunatic and didn't expect this. He then looks at the man with long hair and wonders if he's the only decent person here. With that, he concludes that this must be the 6th brother and perhaps the most reliable person in the group. The 6th brother grabs him by the shoulder and says there's no time to lose, which surprises him. He then encourages him to greet the 4th brother, who is sitting further up the table. The brother points to an empty chair and says that's the 4th brother. With a laugh, the 6th brother continues the joke as if someone were really there. The disciple is completely lost and wonders who on earth he's talking to. Our protagonist remembers that the 4th brother was the one who died fighting against the Orthodox sects. With that, he recalls that the 6th brother's art has a very peculiar side effect. The 6th brother stares at him with frightening green eyes, and he remembers that the art causes schizophrenia. The eldest brother bursts out laughing at the youngest's confusion. He then jokes that the 6th brother has missed the 4th since childhood. The heavenly demon also laughs at the situation, and our protagonist is relieved by the lighter mood. The master then comments on how good it is to see the brothers looking after each other, but he disagrees in his mind. As night falls, he wonders if the banquet will be safe and if he'll get out of it alive. Sitting at the table, he realizes he's starving since he skipped the company dinner. With his hand on the table, he wonders if he can at least enjoy the food to make it all worthwhile. The master then starts talking about a work-related matter. The eldest says for the master not to worry because there are no problems in the area he visited. The young disciple is indignant, wondering if they can't just eat in peace for once. He complains in his head that they keep talking about work even at this time of night. The 6th brother then turns to him and says he'll explain everything in detail. Feigning interest, our protagonist says he'll listen carefully, but thinks he has no choice. The 6th brother explains that the cult conducts periodic inspections of its territories, as shown on the map. He continues, saying that during the last inspection, the master found him, and he became an unexpected variable. Because of this, and to ensure his safety, the master had to return to the main temple earlier than planned. So the dinner was held to receive reports and also to introduce the new disciple. The master suddenly asks the youngest what he thinks, but our protagonist doesn't understand the question. The old man then asks for his opinion on the discussion they just had at the table. The old man asks what he thinks about the way the cult takes care of the common people in its territory. The third brother says that since he's an outsider, he wants to hear a new perspective on the matter. The sixth brother even asks if he has any suggestions to improve things for the cult. Our protagonist tenses up, knowing that for his brothers, the ultimate goal is the master's throne. And to get that throne, they wouldn't hesitate to fight, but our protagonist sees himself as different from them all. He doesn't care if they fight among themselves. His only goal is to enjoy a peaceful life. That's why, from this day forward, he needs to make sure he's completely out of their sight. With no interest in leadership, he decides he will become the eternal middle manager to survive. To do this, he needs to appear somewhat flawed without being too smart or standing out too much. His goal is to act like a super enthusiastic newcomer, full of passion for the job. He won't be incompetent, but he'll always be missing that little something to achieve perfection. The plan is to be the guy who works hard but rarely achieves great results. With all that effort and little return, he will become what you might call a top-tier failure. Fortunately, the young man already knows the perfect answer for this role, the system to escape from it all. With this in mind, he turns to the others and begins to present his idea to them. He says they need to create a reporting system with standardized and rigid formats. This way, the superiors only need to review the reports, and the older brothers no longer have to go there themselves. Secondly, the work would be divided into detailed tasks, and the disciples would rotate regions. He explains that doing the same thing for too long increases the risk of corruption among them. With this rotation of duties and regions, they would prevent disciples from colluding with local powers. By having a reporting structure, transfers between departments would no longer be a problem. He claims that these two measures complement each other and form a perfect system for the cult. However, one of the brothers doesn't look happy with the idea at all and thinks it makes no sense. The third brother thinks that dividing departments and creating reports is the root of irresponsibility. He imagines that work will be delayed and the reports will serve as an excuse to pass the blame to others. The brother also criticizes the idea of departmental rotation and wonders who will handle the handover of tasks. He doubts that just studying old reports is enough to truly understand the work. Besides, it would be lucky if the person who left even bothered to leave any useful notes behind. With that, the third brother decides it's time to put this clueless rookie in his place. He wants to show him the difference between imagination and reality, and what happens when you're too eager. For this lesson, he's even willing to take a punch or two to prove his point. But suddenly, the eldest brother puts a hand on our protagonist's head, who is surprised by the gesture. Putting him in a headlock, the eldest laughs and says the rookie is smarter than he looks. He praises the system for considering corruption and the cult's doctrine, but he thinks that's not what he meant. The master smiles, thinking that the effects of the sword art are already showing, but the disciple denies it in his mind. The sixth brother is impressed by his intelligence. The master then says he'll call him later to discuss the matter, and the protagonist agrees, feeling a bit nervous and disappointed. With that, the old man tells them to stop talking about work and enjoy their drinks, but the young man just wants it all to be over. The next day was a beautiful sunny day. He thinks that bureaucracy might be outdated, but it's better than the chaos of the martial world. Besides, he discovered that the cult had no system, and the master's orders were absolute. With that, he realizes he overestimated things and decides to go for a walk to think more clearly. His attendant then tells him to be back before training and thinks that now she'll have even more work. With a packed schedule and studies, he wonders when he'll ever get to truly rest. As he walks, our protagonist wishes there was something to relax his mind for a bit. Suddenly, he hears a strange noise and turns his head to see what was happening. Looking ahead, he sees a mysterious girl with her back to him, standing near a stream. The girl has a flower in her hair and seems very beautiful, leaving the protagonist completely surprised. With a finger to her lips, the girl seems to be thinking about something.